On this week's Hear These Words, we have Esther flipping the script, bringing down Haman, and turning a plot of destruction into a celebration of freedom. And then we move over to James still, where we are praying, rain, snow, shine, we're always praying. And finally, for all the biblical literalists out there, stay tuned for the Gospel of Mark. Jesus has some hard words and some tools that you'll need to get the work done. All on this week's Hear These Words. Welcome to Hear These Words, a podcast and video series from Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in beautiful Tequesta, Florida. I'm Sanford Groff, I'm the rector here, and today I'm joined by our field education student, Adalia Adams. Hello, Adalia.
Hey, Sanford.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Every week on the podcast, we prepare for the Sunday worship by looking at the lectionary for the upcoming week. And this upcoming Sunday is the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, which is proper 21B as in boy. And the words we hear are Esther, chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, verses 9 through 10, and chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. Psalm 124, James chapter 5, verses 13 through 20, Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 50. Well, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you.
Yes.
You've been here now. This is your third Sunday.
My third Sunday,
We're recording
yes.
this on Sunday.
Yes.
And, you've been at St. Christopher's for a long time.
Very long time.
And you've been very active in your role there. But now you're a postulant for the diaconate.
Yep.
In the
Different
diocese.
role.
And what does that mean?
Oh, postulant to the diaconate. That means I'm preparing to become a deacon in the Episcopal Church. So there's many steps. I completed the field education. I'm sorry.
Just keep going. Yeah, that's good.
I completed the education requirements that was designated by the Center for Christian Formation within the diocese. And now I'm doing a field education where I am implanted within the church and I get to learn all about the different ministries happening within this church.
Yeah, that's great.
So here I am at Good Shepherd.
And the process to become a deacon is many years long, as
Yes,
as you're experiencing.
Yes, it is.
And once you're ordained, you'll be what we call a vocational deacon. So that'll be that is your call, is to be a deacon, and then you'll end up serving somewhere in some church in this diocese. Which would be great.
Yep.
And you'll be the first deacon ordained in this diocese in probably a long time, like almost a decade.
Probably, yes.
Maybe there's one or two others, but I don't think.
Probably about a decade, because just after Bishop Eaton came. Yes.
Right. Good. Well, we're very thankful at Good Shepherd to be able to have you to spend about 9 months with us. So during the program year, you'll be here, and then this is really a Sunday only internship, which means that you're here for church at 8 and 10.
Yes.
You're helping at the altar and doing different readings and praying. This morning you were a Eucharistic visitor or Eucharistic minister. And kind of as we go through this, eventually there'll be some things that we'll look at that you might be interested in jumping into or leading, and that'll be great.
Yeah. See how it goes.
Well, I'm grateful that you're joining me on the podcast today.
Yes.
We're going to start by looking at Esther. I don't know how familiar you are with Esther.
Well, I did read the story, and I was very intrigued by it. It almost reminded me of Herodias.
Right.
Of how, she finally got her revenge afterwards when she got to name her price when, her husband, the king, it's like he didn't even know that she was a Jew. I was like, wait a second. You ordered to kill the Jews? Wait a second. I'm a Jew. I'm your wife.
Right.
So that was interesting.
So you found it to be kind of an intriguing story.
Definitely. Almost like a soap opera-like story. So, I like those stories in the Bible.
Yeah, we're going to get kind of a big chunk here of chapter 7 and also chapter 9. What did you have any comments you want to offer for the good of the order, or you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. In this, the first thing to note is that this is the story that is the basis of the Jewish festival called Purim, right? Purim. And this is a festival that commemorates the Jewish people being delivered from danger, right? Which is this whole story. And the Jewish people today still celebrate Purim. We don't really do that celebration, but we can see here how God's justice is at work through the bravery and advocacy of people like Esther, even in her position. And we talked a lot about the God's kind of great reversals in the sermon today. And here we see Haman's downfall serving as that powerful reversal, where the one who sought to destroy the Jewish people is undone by his own plot.
Exactly.
And that there's something, I don't know if it's irony or what, but there's something kind of just desserts or something.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's kind of it's a little bit of a, you got Mordecai in it. It's not a very, I don't know how familiar, I'm not that familiar with the story, so.
Well, I did dig deep into it only because I wanted to know who the characters were in the story and everything. So I was kind of fascinated to realize that Mordecai was actually Esther's uncle, I believe it is.
Okay.
So he was actually working for the king all of this time, and that was kind of Esther's end, right? So he used Esther to tell Esther what Haman was up to. And, so Haman didn't know that Mordecai and Esther were related.
Right.
So here he is telling what the whole plan was.
Right.
So she goes and her king, her husband, the king, asks her, after a nicer evening of having a lot of fun and probably had a few drinks. And he told her, tell me what you want. I'll give you whatever you want. And she said, can you please spare my life and the life of the Jews? And that's what I started saying before. I find it interesting that he didn't even realize that his own wife was one of those that he had ordered to be killed.
Right.
So, here she got her revenge in a sense of saying, no, don't kill my people. Instead, they kill Haman on the same, what was it, a pole or whatever that he built to kill Mordecai. He was hung from it. So.
Right. Wild.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of wild, and
it's like plot twist. Hold on.
it's a big plot twist. So I think Mordecai, Haman, the gallows. I always think it's kind of interesting how these episodes of the Old Testament are not sanitized, right? They're not like sterilized. They're very kind of visceral and oftentimes violent.
Very.
And yet they kind of connect with our own, maybe not necessarily in the violence of them, but that idea of, identity and who are you and who are you really? I think is always a poignant question for all of us as we kind of think about that. Good.
They're so honest. It's real. Like they don't, they didn't filter anything in the story.
Right. Good. So Psalm 124, we're not going to talk too much about it, but just take a look at it. If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel now say, if the Lord had not been on our side when enemies rose up against us. It ties right into this idea of God's deliverance, right into the way that God protects us. And even how we have, verse 7, we have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowler. So life is filled with these booby traps. Life is always kind of taking twists and turns, and yet God helps us persevere.
Yep. He delivers us just in the nick of time. And
protects us. It's great.
Yes.
So James 5:13 through 20. Take a look at that. Are any among you suffering?
All are.
They should pray. Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise. Are any sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them. On and on it goes. Talks about Elijah. My brothers and sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and is brought back, you should know that whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save the sinner's soul from death and cover a multitude. So a little bit of the lost sheep, right? That lost sheep motif that we get in the Gospels. Here we have that power of prayer and the way in which prayer becomes again, not something that we necessarily add on to our life, but something that becomes enmeshed in the routine and the rhythms of our life. So when things are good, praying, songs of thanksgiving and joy. When things are hard or when we're sad, songs of lament or prayers of lament. And that those are just as close as we can to get to ourselves and to what's actually going on.
Always pray.
What thoughts do you have about James? Any thoughts?
I just thinking he was emphasizing that we need to persevere, trust, and pray. So regardless of the situation, like you just said, we have different forms of prayer. So regardless of the situation you're in, there's always a type of prayer that you can apply to that situation.
Right.
So
right.
Always pray.
And prayer just is, again, it's both talking to God or with God, but it's also listening, right? It's also this kind of deep spiritual listening.
We don't do that very often.
The music's too loud.
Exactly.
It's hard when the music is so loud.
You fall asleep, you doze off, you wake up, you're still talking to God.
I know, yes. I know. It's and yet I think that is a I think the fancy term would be a spiritual discipline, right? It is a regular part of our life, but it doesn't come simply by intending it to come. It comes by habituating it or putting it into the rhythm of our life, right? And
making a conscious effort to do it.
Yeah. And I think in life, there's, are any of you suffering? Are any of you sick? Are any of you cheerful? There has been a time, for many of us, there has been a time in our life where we have been those things, so that when it reappears in a new place or circumstance, it reminds us of how we are drawn back into God's presence.
Right.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
No.
James is not, James gives us quite a lot. The only other thing I would say is that, he goes into this thing about confession, right? And anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. I think when you think of confession as a prayer in and of itself, it might help us to embrace that type of humble posture before God and before each other. I think it's hard to say, hey, I've made a mistake, or, I didn't do that quite the way I wanted to, or I didn't, now in hindsight, I see that wasn't the right thing to do. But James here is exhorting us to confess to one another and pray for each other, but that through that healing, that healing is possible.
Yes.
And, I think that's probably a different talk for a different time, but that idea of reconciliation, and the healing of the wounds, that is hard,
Well, it's opening yourself up to admitting that you committed the sin.
Right.
And it may just be a conversation between you and God. You don't have to confess to the person that you sinned against or that sinned against you.
Right.
But that first step is admitting it.
Yes.
And that admitting it is
in
just
your prayer
to you.
life.
And it's in your prayer. And that's it.
Right.
I think James was very clear in his reading, if this, then that.
Right.
So if you're suffering, then pray. If you're cheerful, pray. If you're doing this, then pray. He gives you the question and he gives you the answer. It doesn't seem to make it too complicated if we would just listen.
Yep. Just listen. Good. Can we move on?
Sure.
Mark 9. We continue through Mark. We're now in this kind of number of weeks where we've got Jesus talking about and doing some hard things. We get, this week, meaning last week at this point, if you're watching it during the week, we had Jesus taking a little child and putting the child, right, and saying you have to become like one of these. This week, he says, if any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones, one of these children who believe in me, it would be better if a great millstone, one of those things that grinds grain, were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea.
Wow.
And if that's not direct, now if you'd like to be a literalist, I have the verse for you.
Right.
If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off.
Ouch.
It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 and be thrown into hell, where the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. And then we have this for every, now, so we don't quote that a lot, right? But then we have this quote, for everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourself and be at peace with one another. So he ends on this image of the saltiness, right? But to get there, you've really got to go through hell and back.
You lost all your body parts.
You've lost half your body parts at least. Yeah.
Exactly.
You want to take a stab at it?
That's rough. I mean, that's just as bad as the Old Testament, just like cutting straight to the grind and not leaving anything out,
Right.
Yeah. That's a tough one. So I think most of us will probably end up in hell according to the Gospel of Mark.
If you're going to read it totally literally, it's going to be, I think it's going to be a bit hard.
Right.
Thankfully, I don't subscribe to a pure,
Literal.
hardcore literal reading. I think we have to make room for literary, tools like hyperbole and metaphor, right?
Right.
So not that.
Just applying it to today's world. It's not necessarily, this is what was understood then, but what do we equate it to today? How does it make sense to us today?
Yep. Any thoughts?
Pretty much if you commit a sin, then acknowledge it. It's almost like what we were saying before, you speak to God about your sins. So it's the same thing, if you have, to cut off your leg or to lose an eye and then go to hell because of it, it's just admitting that sin and then moving on from it. Right. So if you acknowledge that this part of your body that part of your body is representing whatever sin or whatever evil or whatever wrong you've done. Let's use the word wrong instead of sin. I think it sounds a little bit more neutral or forgiving. But acknowledge it and, remove it from your life. So whatever that thing is that's holding you back or that's creating you to not, follow God, acknowledge it and get rid of it. And then you're able to move on and you actually follow God. It's, you're designed to do.
I mean, I think the fact that this is coming after, a couple of weeks ago, we had take up your cross and follow me.
Exactly.
So there's this idea in Christianity and I think the central motif, if I could be so bold to put it at the center, the central motif is death and resurrection. It is the cross, and not because we are seeking suffering as an end in itself, but because the path for transformation goes through a letting go or release or death process. And I think what Jesus is saying here is, it's not just a death that happens to you, my big word would be exogenously, from the outside. It's not just that someone's attacking you from the outside and you're like a martyr, right? It's that all of us recognize that we are still works in progress. We're constantly changing and being transformed into the image and likeness of God. But as we're changing, part of ourself, part of the old self is kind of falling away. I mean, that's my nice way of putting it.
Right.
Jesus is using a much more dramatic
He's got to get the point across.
Metaphor, right? He's like, lop it off.
Exactly.
Like, if it's causing a problem, and if you're not, and I think he's talking about body parts here, but really, there are whole ways of thinking that have to go. There are ways, and we talked about that a little bit today, but there are ways of thinking where I want to be first. I'm aspiring to be the best. I want to be better than you. I want to have more than you. That way of thinking has to be, and I think Jesus is using not a passive verb. He's using an active verb to say, you've got to cut that out. You've got to excise that, get it out of your frame. Because if you're fixated on becoming better than everyone else,
it's not going to get you anywhere.
You're not going to get anywhere.
No.
I mean, that's kind of antithetical to the whole idea of Jesus is, bringing us all in and following him. I mean, if you put yourself in Jesus's place, then there's no need for Jesus.
Right. I don't think Jesus expected us to suffer and to die. We're not supposed to live this life where we're suffering all the time.
Right.
If we actually read the Gospels and we read the different books of the Bible, pretty much very clear in telling us what to do. So if we do these things, we will live like Jesus.
Right.
We wouldn't be suffering like Jesus.
Right.
I mean, right? We're not supposed to be here to be suffering and miserable all the time. We're here to live in his image, and that's a good image, not necessarily a bad image.
Yes.
So,
and really, I would say, again, this is my like Reformation, Lutheran background and my Episcopal identity as well. But the idea here is that you don't do it alone. I don't do it alone.
Absolutely.
And so I think that the challenge for those of us in 2024 is we are used to, and we have been raised to think, I do this by myself. That life depends upon what I can do or what I'm worth or what I'm valued at and what successes I have. And what Jesus is saying is, no, you don't do this alone. You're part of me. I'm kind of leading the way. I'm kind of doing the heavy lifting, but you've got to let me do that.
Right. That alone may be a sin.
And right. Well, and where you feel like you're attached to this worldview or this notion that you've got to do it for yourself, you got to cut that cord, right? You got to cut that way of thinking. Cut that way of thinking out.
Exactly.
And go back to depending on how Jesus is actually inviting us into a life where he has it all.
He got it figured out for you.
He's got it figured out, right? Like it's his kingdom. It's not our kingdom.
Exactly. We don't have to recreate the wheel. This is it. He already did it for us.
Right.
Just follow him.
And that's where I think that's where there's a challenge for us, because we're not yet free of the constraints or the demands that are placed upon us as we walk this mortal. I mean, we got to go to the grocery store. You got to buy food. You got to, I mean, maybe you don't have to have a car. I think you got to have a car. Like,
in South Florida, you need a car.
You need a car, right? So
but we're in this world, right? Not of this world. But we still have to live as part of this world. And there's still some material things that we have to accept that we can't live without.
That's right. But when we're thinking about it in terms of who's in charge, constantly, I'm constantly having to dethrone myself. It's like, Sanford, get off the throne. Good. This is not your, it's not your show, right? Exactly. It's not your, and even though people want to dress me up and sit me on high places,
humble yourself.
You gotta humble yourself. You gotta humble yourself, and that way we become, or we're reminded of the right relations that we are in with God and with Jesus. Okay. I just think I think that's a much more faithful interpretation than But I also think that's not a literal interpretation.
Oh, I can't imagine that Jesus would want us to start cutting off body parts because we did wrong.
I have not met anyone who has literally read this. And if you're taking it as a metaphor, if you're taking it as hyperbole, you're not reading it literally. Exactly. That's literally the opposite of reading it literally.
Exactly. No, that's not what we want.
That is interpreting it.
Exactly.
Is what we want to do. Good. Yes.
What do you think about the last verse on there, though?
Yeah, so salt, salt and have salt in yourselves. So. Well, I mean, a lot of people watch this podcast, but I'll probably preach about this at some point. So if I repeat myself, it's okay.
It's okay.
As a chef, right?
Okay.
As a cook, as a line cook, sous chef. You use salt to bring out the flavors of other things. You don't use salt to replace.
Exactly.
You don't want something to. I mean, unless it's like a pretzel or something. But like you don't use salt to make your chicken taste like salt. You make it bring out the other flavors. And in this way, I think Jesus is kind of saying, when you have salt in yourself, you are bringing out that image of God. You're kind of accentuating all the gifts that God has given you. When you're salty, it's actually a way of highlighting the goodness of life and the God-given parts of our life. So have salt in yourself and be at peace with one another. That salt is a flavor enhancer. It's not a flavor replacer.
I like that.
So that's my interpretation of that part. Yours?
That works. That's what I'm thinking.
You're going to lost its saltiness.
Well, kind of, because, like you said, salt enhances the flavor of things. We're not replacing it. So, as long as we stay salty, then, we will always thirst for more. Right? We will always want more. We always want to learn more. We always want to get closer to God. So that's the saltiness that I'm thinking of. It's just as long as you stay salty, you'll still be thirsting more for the Lord.
Yeah. It kind of drives you to that greater relationship.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing to think about is salt is also a preservative, right? And in the ancient world, they didn't have benzodiazepine number 10 or whatever they throw in our food nowadays. They just use salt, right? Or sugar or different other preservative methods that were natural. And so this idea of salt losing its saltiness, how can you season with it? The idea being that it is a way of, and I guess I'm thinking more the salt, everyone will be salted with fire. That idea of purifying, preserving.
It fine tunes it, maybe?
Fine-tuning, kind of bringing out the best.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's a rich passage.
It is. There's a lot in there.
Thank goodness I don't have to preach for 6 days.
Well, you got 6 days to plan for it now.
6 days.
You got this.
Pray.
Pray.
Pray and plan.
That's what James said.
Well, anything else you want to say? Anything else you want to tell us about you just before we head off into the sunset here?
No, I'm happy to be at Good Shepherd and looking forward to my time here and learning all about the different ministries and the people here. So it should be a good time.
If you're hearing or watching us, be sure to say hello to Adalia and say, I saw you on the podcast. Yes. You can just say, it was great.
Lie to me. It's okay.
It's okay. You can always just tell us tales.
Yes.
Tell us sweet little lies.
Yes,
it's good.
I'll take that.
Well, we are thankful that you joined us for today's episode, and you can never miss an episode by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts or subscribing to our YouTube channel. If you liked what you heard, please give us a thumbs up or a like, and share it with your friends and your neighbors. It's always good to share. Adalia, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
And now we hope you feel a little more prepared to hear these words. See you soon.